let's prepare our fabric to do a French seam. So for this, you're going to need 2 of your pattern pieces. I do recommend that you diverge from what you've been doing thus far and do not use muslin. Try and find a fabric that has a very clear and distinct right side and wrong side. That is going to make the accomplishment of this technique much easier to understand and to grasp. You can, if you don't have any scrap fabric that's got this clear, this is the right side, this is the wrong side, you can do it with muslin. You just will want to write the word right and the word wrong on your fabric so you know which is the right side and which is the wrong side. But if you can, I do highly recommend you do a French seam with fabric that you can tell what is the right side and the wrong side, because the French seam can be really tricky as a beginner because you're going to do a couple of things that are just weird and different. So for demonstration purposes, I am going to use this fabric because you can tell what is the right side and what is the wrong side. We are also going to make a bit of a difference for this pattern or this technique because I don't have stitch lines drawn on here. I'm going to use the seam allowance lines that are on the sewing machine to tell me what distance I am stitching at. That just makes this so much easier. Okay, so for most sewing techniques, we are putting our fabrics together, right sides together first. But for a French seam, we're doing that backwards. We're putting wrong sides together. So when you look at the sides, you've got the right sides facing out. Because we're following the stitch lines in the sewing machine, we want to make sure that these edges are nice and straight with each other. And because I am just using the stitch lines on the machine for my seam allowance, I'm going to put my pins in horizontally like this so that I can stitch over them, since I am not lining up stitching lines. Now you can do this technique by drawing on the stitch lines, but that I feel like for beginners can make things feel a bit more complicated. Okay, so I've got everything here laid out. Wrong sides are together. Let's take this to the sewing machine. So we're going to be following the guidelines on the throat plate of the sewing machine. The first stitch seam allowance we're going to do is 1/4 of an inch, which if you convert any of these fractions, none of this is 1/4 of an inch. On this machine, 1/4 of an inch, refocus, is the edge of the presser foot. So that is where we're going to start sewing. I'm going to line my fabric up. And I'm just watching the edge of my fabric and making sure it stays next to the edge of the presser foot. And we're going to sew a straight line just like always, including a back stitch. Okay, take that off. Oh no, I ran out of bobbin. All right, hang tight. Okay, I have a new bobbin in place, so what I'm gonna do is, just like I would anytime that I've run out of bobbin part of the way through, I don't have to, I don't have to take all of this out. I'm just gonna start on top of right before it ran out. Back stitch, keep going forward. Not a big deal. All right, now that works. Okay. So trim all of your threads, take your pins out, and then we want to take this to the ironing board. So now we're going to take the seam that we have stitched, we're going to press it open. It can be a little tricky because the seam allowance is kind of small. Make sure you press this open really nicely. Sorry, camera got bumped. We're gonna press from the other side as well. Make it nice and crisp. Okay, so now what we wanna do, now that we've pressed this open, this helps actually with the next fold section. So we want to fold this over and press it again right on that fold, right where that seam was. Give it another good press. What the French seam is accomplishing is that it is a self-sealing seam. Just like the flat felled seam, it is going to encase all of the raw edges on the inside. So let me grab some pins real quick. All right, and now we're gonna pin this together. So if you've done this correctly up to this point, you should now see the wrong side of the fabric facing toward you. I'm gonna pin it just like before. There we go. And now what we're gonna do is we're gonna sew another line along here, but this time at a 1/2 of an inch. So grand total, we have used 5/8 of an inch of fabric to sew this seam. And when we sew this 1/2 inch, since our previous stitch length was 1/4 of an inch, we're gonna encase all of those raw edges. So let's take this to the sewing machine and see how this turns out. Okay, similar to before, we're gonna follow the stitch lines on the throat plate. This time we wanna sew at 1/2 an inch. And for some reason, all of the fractions on this machine are shown in eighths. So 4/8 is the same thing as 1/2 an inch. So I'm gonna line my fabric up with that edge. And you can kind of feel, if you look for where the needle's going to hit and you feel your seam allowance, you can tell that you're gonna sew to the side of the seam allowance, or you're not gonna catch the seam allowance. It's gonna be kind of put in as a tunnel. Back stitch. Stitch all the way down. Okay, take this off the machine. Right, get my machine out of the way, and let's take a closer look at this sample. Clip the threads, pull my pins out. So now if we open this up, all of the raw edges are completely encased on the inside. It does make for a bit of a bulky seam right here if you're using the French seam with thick fabrics. A French seam is most often used with sheer fabrics where you're gonna see the seam allowance no matter what, and delicate fabrics that need the fabric encased so that they don't fray or unravel on you. But that is a French seam. If you happen to flip to the right side and you see some of your raw edges sticking out, that means that you either on the first step didn't get quite 1/4 of an inch, or on the second step you got a little smaller than 1/2 an inch. You can also do this a lot smaller by, after that first step, whatever amount you sew, you can trim your seam allowance down smaller, and then this stitch line can move closer to the edge. But this is how mathematically you come out to having used 5/8 of an inch of seam allowance total. The first row is 1/4 of an inch, the second row is 1/2 an inch. If you add those fractions together, no, it equals 3/4, not 5/8 of an inch. Math. This is why the French seam is not my favorite, is because you have to do a lot of extra math to get it to come out the way you want. So we have used 3/4 of an amount of seam allowance. All right, hopefully you've completed the French seam successfully, and I'm gonna stop talking now because the video is over.